Nobody at the party noticed the quiet, gray-haired woman standing alone near the dessert table, holding an empty plate and smiling politely at strangers who walked right past her. She wasn't wearing diamonds. She wasn't wearing designer heels. To every guest in that glittering ballroom, she looked like nobody important at all. But in exactly 4 minutes, that woman would be humiliated in front of 200 people by the very woman planning to marry her son. And in the 5 seconds after that, everyone in that room would learn exactly who really owned the building they were standing in. Hey everyone, welcome back. If this is your first time here, this channel is all about real, raw, emotional stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Before we dive in, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or your flag in the comments below. We love seeing how far this little community reaches. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told, so if you've got a few quiet minutes, settle in. You're not going to want to look away. She had learned a long time ago that the smaller you make yourself, the less the world bothers to notice you, and most days Eleanor Whitfield preferred it that way. At 65, Eleanor still woke up before 6 every morning, the way she had for the last 40 years. She still made her own coffee in the same chipped mug she'd bought at a yard sale in 1994. She still walked 2 blocks to the Maplewood Community Center 3 mornings a week to help serve breakfast to whoever needed one. And she still drove the same faded blue sedan that rattled a little going over the railroad tracks on 5th Street. Her house was small, white, and a little crooked at the porch steps, tucked at the end of a quiet street where the trees had grown tall enough to shade the whole block. She had lived there for 38 years. She planned to die there. None of that matched what people assumed the moment they learned her last name. Because Eleanor Whitfield was the mother of Daniel Whitfield, the Daniel Whitfield, founder and CEO of Whitfield Technologies, a man whose name showed up in business magazines and whose net worth had more zeros in it than Eleanor could comfortably picture. To the outside world, Daniel was a billionaire before he turned 35. To Eleanor, he was still the skinny, serious boy who used to sit at her kitchen table doing homework by lamplight because she couldn't always afford to keep every light in the house on. She thought about that boy every single day. She thought about him especially on mornings like this one, when she stood at her kitchen sink washing yesterday's dishes and looked out the window at the same cracked driveway she used to scrape ice off of before dawn, back when she worked double shifts at the diner on Grant Avenue just to keep food on the table after Daniel's father died. Eleanor had been 28 when she became a widow. Daniel had been 6. There was no life insurance to speak of, no family fortune waiting in the wings, no safety net at all. Just Eleanor, a boy who missed his father more than he had words for, and a stack of bills that never seemed to get smaller. She worked mornings at the diner and evenings hemming clothes for neighbors who paid her in cash or casseroles. She never once let Daniel see her cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because she needed him to believe the world was safe even when she wasn't sure it was. She used to tell him when he was small and asking why they didn't have what other kids had, that some things mattered more than money. Kindness mattered more. Honesty mattered more. Showing up for people mattered more. She said it so many times over the years that by the time Daniel grew up, built his company from a rented garage, and became one of the wealthiest men in the country, those words were stitched so deep into him that even success never fully loosened them. That was the strange, quiet truth about Daniel Whitfield that most people never got to see. Behind the tailored suits and the boardrooms and the private jets, he still called his mother every single Sunday at 7 in the evening, without fail. He still drove out to Maplewood himself instead of sending a car, still sat at her kitchen table, still ate whatever she put in front of him like it was the best meal in the world, because to him it always was. "You could stay in one of the guest houses," he told her once, only half joking, gesturing vaguely toward the estate he'd bought an hour outside the city. "You'd never have to lift a dish again." Eleanor had just laughed and swatted his arm with a dish towel. "And what would I do all day? Sit around admiring how big the ceilings are." She meant it as a joke, but there was truth underneath it. Eleanor didn't want the big house. She didn't want the driver, or the wardrobe, or the version of life where people spoke to her differently because of who her son had become. She had watched, quietly and carefully, how money changed the way people were treated, how doors opened faster, how smiles came easier, how suddenly everyone wanted to be your closest friend. She had also watched, just as quietly, how the same people could turn cold and dismissive toward anyone who didn't look like they belonged. She didn't want to become someone people were nice to only because of her son's bank account. She wanted, more than anything, to remain exactly who she'd always been. Which was why, on the morning her son called to tell her the big news, Eleanor sat down slowly on her kitchen chair and pressed her hand flat against her chest. "Mom," Daniel said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even through the phone. "I asked Vanessa to marry me. She said yes." Eleanor closed her eyes for a second before she answered. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. "That's wonderful." And it was wonderful, or it should have been. Daniel sounded happier than she'd heard him in years. He talked quickly, the way he used to when he was a boy describing something he loved, about how Vanessa was sharp and stylish and always seemed to know exactly what to say in a room full of important people, about how she'd grown up around business the way he had grown up around bills, about how she made him feel like less of an outsider in the world he now belonged to. Eleanor listened to every word. She wanted badly to feel only happiness for him. But somewhere underneath the joy in her chest, a small and uneasy feeling had begun to settle, one she couldn't quite explain and one she didn't dare say out loud. She had met Vanessa exactly twice. Both times Vanessa had been polished, polite, perfectly pleasant. And both times Eleanor had noticed the same small thing, the way Vanessa's eyes moved quickly over her second-hand cardigan and her worn shoes, lingered there for half a second too long, and then moved on with a smile that didn't quite reach the rest of her face. Eleanor told herself she was imagining it. She told herself that a woman who made her son this happy deserved the benefit of the doubt. She told herself that in 6 weeks, at the engagement party Daniel was planning at the Kensington Grand downtown, she would meet Vanessa properly, and every quiet worry she carried would turn out to be nothing at all. She wanted so badly to believe that. 200 miles away, in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the entire skyline, Vanessa Cole was already deep into planning the party that would announce her engagement to the world. She sat at her marble kitchen island with 3 laptops open, a stack of fabric swatches fanned out beside a half-finished mimosa, and a guest list of 212 names that she had personally reviewed line by line. Every detail mattered to Vanessa, not because she cared deeply about flowers or lighting or the exact shade of ivory on the tablecloths, but because she understood something most people didn't. A party like this wasn't a celebration. It was a performance. And Vanessa intended to be the star of it. She had grown up comfortable, the only daughter of Richard Cole, a real estate investor with a respectable fortune and an even more respectable list of contacts. Comfortable, though, had never felt like enough. Vanessa had spent her whole life watching people with real money. Old money, new money, Daniel Whitfield money. And she had decided somewhere around age 19 exactly what she wanted her life to look like. She wanted the penthouse. She wanted the name that made headwaiters straighten their posture. She wanted a life where nobody ever again looked at her the way certain girls at her private school once had. Back when her father's business nearly collapsed and the Coles spent one humiliating year clipping coupons. Daniel Whitfield had seemed, from the very first dinner they shared, like the answer to every version of that old fear. He was brilliant, focused, generous, and, best of all as far as Vanessa was concerned, completely unbothered by appearances. He didn't care about labels or reservations at the right restaurant. In a strange way that made him easier to manage. Vanessa handled the image. Daniel handled the substance. It worked, she told herself. It worked beautifully. There was only one part of Daniel's life that Vanessa had never quite figured out how to handle, and that was his mother. Eleanor unsettled her, though Vanessa would never have admitted that out loud, not even to herself. It wasn't anything Eleanor said or did. The woman was polite, even warm in the 2 brief meetings they'd had. It was something quieter than that. It was the way Daniel's whole posture changed around her, softened in a way Vanessa had never quite managed to produce in him. It was the plain little house Vanessa had glimpsed once from the car, the chipped mug on the counter, the framed photo on the wall of a young widow and a serious little boy standing in front of a diner that clearly wasn't theirs. To Vanessa, all of it read as something to be managed, discreetly at arm's length, a chapter of Daniel's story that had served its purpose and could now be gently closed. She didn't think of it as cruelty. She thought of it as tidiness. "She's not exactly going to be sipping champagne with the board members' wives," Vanessa said one evening to her best friend and maid of honor, Priya, as they went over the seating chart. "I just think it's kinder, honestly, to keep her somewhere comfortable. Somewhere she won't feel out of place." Priya, scrolling through her phone, only half listened. "Sure. Whatever's easiest." Vanessa nodded to herself, satisfied, and circled a table near the kitchen doors on the seating chart. Table 19. Far enough from the main floor that no investor would have to make small talk with a woman who, as far as Vanessa's world was concerned, had nothing to offer any of them. She didn't stop to consider that the woman she was quietly sidelining had built, with her own two exhausted hands, every value that had made Daniel the man Vanessa wanted to marry in the first place. Over the following weeks, the tension crept in slowly, the way tension usually does. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones. Daniel mentioned more than once how much he wanted his mother to feel comfortable and included at the party. Vanessa agreed every time with a smile and a nod, and then quietly kept making decisions that ensured the opposite. She told the florist not to bother with the center house arrangement for table 19. She told the event coordinator that the older guests near the back didn't need to be included in the champagne toast choreography. Small things. Manageable things. Things Daniel, buried in a product launch at work, never noticed. Meanwhile in Maplewood, Eleanor bought a new dress for the first time in 6 years. A simple soft blue one from the clearance rack at the department store outside town, and hung it carefully in her closet, smoothing the fabric with her hand every time she walked past it, already a little nervous about the night ahead. She wasn't nervous about the crowd or the wealth, or the size of the ballroom Daniel had described to her over the phone. She was nervous about one thing only, that the small, uneasy feeling she carried about Vanessa might turn out to be true. And more than that, she was nervous about what it would mean for her son if it was. 3 days before the party, one of the venue's junior event staff, a young woman named Carla, happened to overhear Vanessa on the phone in the Kensington Grand Service hallway. "She'll be fine at 19, Vanessa was saying, laughing lightly. "Honestly, I doubt she'll even notice. Women like that are used to sitting in the back." Carla didn't know who she was. She didn't think much of it at the time. She simply finished folding napkins and went back to work, the comment settling somewhere in the back of her mind, the way small cruelties often do, waiting, without either of them knowing it yet, for the one night when it would matter most. Have you ever sensed something was off about someone before anyone else could see it? Let us know how it turned out. The night of the engagement party, the Kensington Grand Ballroom looked like something out of a magazine. Chandeliers dripping gold light over round tables dressed in ivory and champagne, a live string quartet tucked in one corner, and 200 of the city's most important people mingling with glasses in hand beneath ceilings so high they seemed to swallow the sound of conversation whole. Eleanor arrived quietly, in her simple blue dress, carrying a small clutch purse that had belonged to her own mother. She had asked Daniel not to send a car for her. She preferred to drive herself the way she preferred most things, and she slipped in through the side entrance near the coat check, a little overwhelmed by the size of the room and the sheer, glittering unfamiliarity of it all. Nobody stopped her. Nobody greeted her. A young server glanced at her for half a second, decided she must be someone's grandmother wandering from her assigned table, and moved on without a word. Eleanor found her name card at table 19, tucked near the kitchen doors, far from the small stage where Daniel and Vanessa would soon make their toast. She sat down anyway, folded her hands in her lap, and told herself it didn't matter where she sat. She had come to see her son happy. That was enough. Should have been enough. But as the evening wore on, and Eleanor watched from her quiet corner table as elegant strangers laughed and toasted and complimented each other's jewelry, something inside her chest grew heavier with every passing minute. She recognized, with painful clarity, exactly what kind of evening this had been arranged to be. Not a celebration that included her. A celebration that had simply allowed her to attend. She stood, eventually, and made her way toward the dessert table near the center of the room, mostly just to have something to do with her hands, something to look at besides the empty seats around her. That was where Vanessa found her. Vanessa had spent the last hour drinking just enough champagne to feel bold, laughing just loud enough to be noticed, standing at the center of a small cluster of guests that included two of Daniel's most important board members and their wives. She was mid-sentence, describing some story about a wedding dress fitting, when she spotted the plain, gray-haired woman near the dessert table, quietly holding a small plate, smiling politely at guests who walked past without a glance. Something about it, the plainness of her, the way she stood there so unbothered, so entirely comfortable being unnoticed in a room built for exactly the opposite, irritated Vanessa in a way she couldn't fully explain, even to herself. She excused herself from her small crowd and crossed the room with her champagne glass in hand. "I'm so sorry," Vanessa said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry a bright, brittle smile fixed in place. "But this area is really meant for close family and important guests. I don't think we've actually met. Are you with the catering staff?" Eleanor felt her face go warm. Around them, a few guests had turned to watch, drawn by the sharp edge underneath Vanessa's polite tone. "I'm Daniel's mother," Eleanor said quietly, steadying her voice as best she could. "Eleanor." For half a second, something flickered across Vanessa's face. Recognition, unmistakable, followed almost instantly by something colder. She knew exactly who this woman was. She had known from the very first glance. And in that half-second, with a small crowd watching and champagne warm in her blood, Vanessa made a choice. "Of course you are," Vanessa said, her smile tightening into something sharp. "I should have guessed. I did ask that you stay comfortable near the back. This part of the room is really for people who matter to Daniel's business tonight. I don't think you understand how important some of these guests are." A hush rippled outward from the small group nearby. Eleanor stood very still, her hands trembling slightly around her small plate, humiliation rising hot in her throat. "I only wanted to see my son on his happy night," she said softly. "Then maybe," Vanessa said, her voice climbing, loud enough now that heads across the ballroom began to turn, "you should have stayed where you were seated. Know your place." And then, before anyone could fully register what was happening, Vanessa lifted her nearly full glass of soda water and threw it, deliberately, furiously, directly at Eleanor. The liquid struck Eleanor square across the front of her simple blue dress, ice cubes clattering to the marble floor, gasps rippling outward across the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor stood frozen, soaked, humiliated in front of 200 strangers, her small plate trembling in her hand, tears burning at the corners of her eyes that she refused, with every ounce of strength she had left, to let fall. The room had gone utterly silent. And that was the exact moment Daniel Whitfield walked through the ballroom doors. He had been in the lobby taking a call from his lead investor, and he'd heard the raised voice before he even reached the doorway. Heard the words "Know your place" ringing out over the string quartet, heard the gasp that followed. He stepped into the ballroom just in time to see the soda still dripping from his mother's dress, just in time to see her standing there, drenched and humiliated, in front of every single person who mattered to his business and his future. Nobody in that ballroom moved. Nobody breathed. Daniel crossed the floor in seconds, and when he reached his mother's side, he didn't say a single word to her. He simply took off his own suit jacket and placed it gently around her shoulders, his hand resting there for a moment, steady and protective. Then, slowly, he turned to face Vanessa, his expression unreadable, the entire room watching, waiting, holding its breath for whatever was about to happen next. For a long moment Daniel said nothing at all. He simply looked at Vanessa, really looked at her, the way you look at someone you thought you knew completely and are suddenly seeing for the very first time. "Daniel," Vanessa said quickly, her voice shifting instantly, the sharpness draining out of it and something pleading rushing in to replace it. "It's not what it looked like. I didn't realize. I was startled. You knew exactly who she was," Daniel said quietly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In a room that's silent, every word carried to the very back tables. "You've met my mother twice. You knew her name before you said a single word to her tonight." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Across the room, Carla, the young event staffer, stood frozen near the kitchen doors, the overheard phone call from 3 days earlier suddenly making horrible, complete sense. Daniel turned to his mother, his hand still resting gently on her shoulder. "Mom, are you all right?" Eleanor, soaked and shaking but somehow steadier now that her son was beside her, nodded. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said softly. "Truly." But Daniel could see, in the careful way she held herself, in the wet fabric clinging to her simple blue dress, exactly how far from fine she was. And something in him, something that had been quietly gathering for weeks, small comment by small comment, without him ever letting himself fully look at it, finally came into focus all at once. He thought about the seating chart Vanessa had shown him, the one with his mother's name tucked near the kitchen doors, and how Vanessa had explained it as keeping her comfortable. He thought about the offhand comments Vanessa made about his mother's clothes, her house, her modest life. Comments he had brushed aside a dozen times, telling himself he was being too sensitive, that Vanessa didn't mean any harm by them. He thought about every small moment he had quietly excused because he wanted so badly to believe the life he was building could include both the woman he loved and the woman who had raised him. He understood now, standing in the middle of that silent ballroom, that he could no longer excuse any of it. Richard Cole, Vanessa's father, pushed through the crowd toward them, his face tight with alarm. Not for Eleanor, Daniel noticed, but for the deal. Richard sat on Whitfield Technologies' board. His investment firm held a significant stake in the company's upcoming expansion. A broken engagement wouldn't just be a personal embarrassment. It would ripple through boardrooms and headlines for months, and Richard knew it instantly. "Daniel," Richard said, lowering his voice, pulling him half a step aside. "Let's not do anything rash here. Emotions are high. We can smooth this over quietly, for everyone's sake." For a moment Daniel hesitated. He was aware, in the coldest, most practical part of his mind, of exactly what was at stake. The merger Richard's firm was backing represented years of work and hundreds of jobs. A public scandal tonight could unravel all of it. Every instinct that had built his company from nothing was telling him to think strategically, to step back, to handle this delicately and privately. But then he looked at his mother again, soaked, humiliated, standing in a room full of people who had watched her be told out loud to know her place, and he thought about every double shift she had worked so he could have shoes that fit, every dinner she had skipped so he could eat, every soft word she had said to him on the nights he missed his father so badly he couldn't breathe. He thought about the woman who had never once, not for a single day of his life, made him feel like he didn't belong exactly where he was. And he understood with total clarity that there was no version of his future he wanted badly enough to trade his mother's dignity for it. "No," Daniel said quietly, turning back to face the room. "We're not smoothing this over." He raised his voice then, not in anger, but with the kind of calm authority that made every conversation in that ballroom stop completely. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he said. "But there isn't going to be a wedding." A wave of murmurs swept across the room. Vanessa's face went pale. "Daniel, please," she said, her voice cracking now, genuine panic breaking through the polish for the first time all evening. "Can we talk about this privately? Everyone is watching." Everyone was watching a few minutes ago too, Daniel said, when you threw a glass of soda at my mother and told her to know her place. He let the words settle over the silent room. I think they deserve to see how it ends, the same way they saw how it started. Vanessa stood frozen, the champagne glass still somehow in her hand, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her, the full weight of the evening finally, completely closing in. Eleanor, still wrapped in her son's suit jacket, reached out and gently touched Daniel's arm. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "you don't have to do this for me. Not in front of everyone. Not because of the business." Daniel looked down at her, his expression softening for the first time since he'd walked through those doors. "I'm not doing it because of the business, Mom," he said quietly. "I'm doing it because of everything you ever taught me. You always said kindness mattered more than money. Tonight I finally understood what you meant. Have you ever had to choose between what was easy and what was right? Tell us what happened." The ballroom stayed silent for what felt like a very long time after that. Then, slowly, from somewhere near the back of the room, a single guest began to clap. It was an older man Eleanor didn't recognize. Later she would learn he was one of Daniel's earliest investors, a man who had believed in him back when Whitfield Technologies was just 2 people and a rented garage. Then another guest joined in. And another. Within a few seconds, the applause had spread across the entire ballroom, not for the spectacle of it, but for something quieter and more important, for a young man who had chosen his mother's dignity over 200 watching eyes and everything they represented. Vanessa didn't wait for the applause to fade. She set her glass down on the nearest table, gathered what remained of her composure, and walked quickly toward the exit, her father hurrying after her, already murmuring something about damage control and lawyers and public relations. Nobody in the room tried to stop her. Nobody needed to. Daniel didn't watch her go. He was already kneeling slightly, helping his mother settle into a chair someone had quickly pulled over, asking the nearest server for a warm towel, checking, gently and repeatedly, that she truly was all right. "I'm fine," Eleanor said again, and this time, for the first time all evening, she almost believed it herself. She looked up at her son, at the suit jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, at the quiet, steady concern on his face, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not triumph exactly, but something close to peace. "You didn't have to give up all of that for me," she said softly. "The deal. The wedding. All of it." Daniel knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "Mom," he said, "you gave up everything for me for years, and you never once made it feel like a sacrifice. The least I could do was give up one deal for you." Across the ballroom, Richard Cole's business associates were already quietly recalculating, murmuring among themselves. Not about scandal, but about character, about the kind of man who chooses his mother over a merger in front of 200 witnesses. By the following week, 2 of the very investors Richard had feared losing would personally reach out to Daniel with new proposals of their own, unprompted, saying simply that they wanted to work with a man who valued the right things. The deal Daniel feared losing that night didn't collapse. It found new footing, built on steadier ground than before. But that wasn't the part of the story that mattered most, not to Daniel, and certainly not to Eleanor. What mattered was smaller than that, and far more lasting. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began driving out to Maplewood more often, not just for Sunday dinners, but sometimes in the middle of the week, just to sit at that same kitchen table and talk, the way he used to when he was young and the world felt smaller and simpler. He started showing up, quietly and without cameras, at the Maplewood Community Center where his mother volunteered, helping serve breakfast alongside her some mornings before work, learning, slowly, what she had been trying to teach him his whole life, that the people who never make it into any seating chart are very often the ones who matter most. Eleanor, for her part, never once brought up that night at the party unless someone else brought it up first. She wasn't the type to hold a grudge or replay old hurts. But something in her had shifted too. A little more confidence in the space she took up in a room, a little less inclination to shrink herself down to fit into corners the world tried to assign her. She kept her small house on the quiet street with the tall trees. She kept the chipped mug and the faded blue sedan. But she stopped, quietly and gradually, apologizing for taking up space at all. One Sunday evening, nearly 2 months later, as Daniel sat across from her at that same worn kitchen table, he looked up from his plate and said, almost to himself, "I used to think success meant leaving all of this behind, Mom. The small house. The plain dinners. I thought I was supposed to outgrow it." Eleanor smiled, reaching over to refill his glass. "And now I think the whole point," Daniel said slowly, "was never to leave it behind. It was to bring it with me. That's the only reason any of the rest of it means anything at all." Eleanor didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. She simply reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand, the same way she had on countless hard nights 30 years earlier, when it was just the two of them against a world that hadn't yet learned what either of them was capable of. To everyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like the end of an engagement, a scandal, a headline that faded within a news cycle or two. But to Eleanor and Daniel, it was something else entirely. The moment a room full of strangers finally saw what mattered most wasn't the name on the invitation or the seat at the table, but the quiet, steady love that had built everything worth having in the first place. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The way you treat someone who seems to have nothing to offer you tells the whole truth about who you really are. And sooner or later, in front of exactly the people who matter most, that truth always finds its way into the light. Thank you truly for spending this time with us tonight, and for letting Eleanor and Daniel's story sit with you the way it sat with us. If it moved you even a little, we hope you'll carry a piece of it with you the next time you walk into a room full of strangers. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like Eleanor's reach more people who need to hear them. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe because we share emotional, true-to-life stories just like this one every single week. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Be honest. What would you have done if you were standing in that ballroom the moment that glass was thrown? If this story touched something in you, please share it with someone who might need it today. Maybe someone who's ever felt overlooked, or someone who could use the reminder to always look a little closer at the people the world tends to walk past. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next story.